A single recipe for peach preserves, written in fading ink on yellowed paper, would become the most deadly document in the history of the Georgia Territory. 5 women, 5 kitchens, 5 carefully orchestrated murders, all connected by handwritten instructions that promised sweetness, but delivered only death. Before we begin today's journey into the shadows of antebellum Georgia, I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to all of you who have made this community what it is today. To those who have subscribed, shared these stories, and taken the time to engage with each episode, your support continues to fuel our exploration of history's most perplexing mysteries. A special acknowledgement goes to our dedicated members, whose names appear on screen now. Your commitment to preserving these forgotten tales goes above and beyond. For those interested in joining this exclusive community, the membership link awaits in the description below. Now settle in as we uncover 5 interconnected cases from 5 different counties across the Georgia Territory, each bound together by a recipe that was never meant for preservation. The year 1821 marked a pivotal moment in Georgia's transformation from frontier territory to established state. Cotton had become king, bringing unprecedented wealth to plantation owners while simultaneously deepening the state's dependence on enslaved labor. The invention of the cotton gin had revolutionized agriculture, and small towns were sprouting along river routes that carried white gold to Savannah's bustling ports. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity, tensions simmered. The Missouri Compromise had just been signed, igniting heated debates about slavery's expansion, while Creek and Cherokee nations faced increasing pressure to surrender their ancestral lands. It was against this backdrop of progress and prejudice that our first case unfolds in the rolling hills of Clark County, where the newly established Athens was beginning to establish itself as a center of learning and culture. Constance Blackwood arrived in Athens in the spring of 1820, carrying little more than her late husband's medical instruments and a determination to rebuild her life. At 32, she possessed an unusual combination of beauty and intelligence that made her both admired and distrusted by the wives of Athens' emerging merchant class. Her late husband, Dr. Edmund Blackwood, had died of consumption during their journey south from Charleston, leaving Constance with medical knowledge that was both valuable and, for a woman, deeply suspicious. The newly formed University of Georgia had brought educated men to Athens, but their wives often struggled with the isolation of frontier life. Constance quickly established herself as an invaluable companion to these women, offering remedies for everything from melancholia to difficult pregnancies. Her modest boarding house room became an informal salon where wives gathered to share gossip, recipes, and complaints about their husbands. Among her regular visitors was Prudence Hartwell, wife of Judge Marcus Hartwell, a stern Methodist who had been appointed to oversee the county's rapid legal development. Prudence was known for her elaborate dinner parties and her fierce competition with other wives over who could present the most impressive table. She had heard rumors that Constance possessed a special recipe for peach preserves that could maintain their color and sweetness throughout the winter months. The recipe itself seemed innocent enough, calling for fresh peaches, sugar, and what appeared to be common spices. But hidden within the elegant script was a deadly secret that Constance had discovered quite by accident while experimenting with her late husband's medicinal compounds. On the evening of August 15, 1821, Judge Hartwell returned from a particularly contentious day in court to find his wife's prized preserves waiting on the dinner table. The judge was known for his sweet tooth and his habit of consuming an entire jar of preserves with his evening meal. That night, neighbors reported hearing terrible screaming coming from the Hartwell mansion, followed by an eerie silence that lasted until dawn. When the housekeeper arrived the following morning, she discovered Judge Hartwell sprawled across his study floor, his face contorted in agony. The empty preserve jar sat on his desk, its contents apparently consumed entirely. Dr. William Morrison, the county's only physician, attributed the death to apoplexy, common enough among men of the judge's age and temperament. Prudence Hartwell's grief appeared genuine and profound. She spoke movingly at the funeral about her husband's dedication to justice and his love of her cooking. The community rallied around the young widow, and Constance Blackwood was particularly attentive, helping Prudence navigate the complex process of settling her husband's estate. What the community didn't know was that Judge Hartwell had been investigating irregularities in several property transfers, irregularities that threatened to expose a network of fraudulent land deals involving some of Athens' most prominent citizens. His death effectively ended the investigation, allowing certain parties to rest easier in their beds. Our second case takes us southeast to Richmond County, where Augusta had established itself as a vital trading post along the Savannah River. The town's strategic location made it a magnet for merchants, speculators, and adventurers seeking their fortunes in Georgia's expanding cotton economy. Margaret Sinclair had arrived in Augusta 3 years earlier as the bride of Captain James Sinclair, a riverboat captain whose fleet transported cotton from inland plantations to Savannah's export houses. At 28, Margaret possessed a sharp mind for business and a reputation for hospitality that made the Sinclair home a gathering place for the town's merchant community. The captain's frequent absences left Margaret to manage not only their household, but also significant portions of his business operations. She had proven herself remarkably capable, negotiating contracts and managing accounts with a skill that impressed even Augusta's most hardened businessmen. However, her success had also created enemies among those who believed women had no place in commerce. In the late summer of 1821, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. A woman traveling through Augusta had heard of Margaret's reputation as a hostess and requested to share a recipe that had made her famous in Charleston's social circles. The visitor introduced herself as Mrs. Caroline Whitmore, claiming to be the widow of a prominent rice planter. The recipe Mrs. Whitmore shared was for the same peach preserves that had appeared in Athens, though presented with slight variations that made it seem like a family secret passed down through generations. Margaret was delighted to receive such a gift, particularly as she was planning an elaborate reception for her husband's return from his latest voyage. Captain Sinclair's homecoming celebration on September 3rd was remembered as one of Augusta's most elegant affairs. The captain regaled his guests with tales of river adventures, while Margaret's preserves were praised as the finest anyone had tasted. The captain himself consumed multiple servings, declaring them worthy of Charleston's finest tables. The celebration continued well into the night, with guests departing in high spirits. Captain Sinclair retired to his study to review shipping manifests while Margaret supervised the kitchen cleanup. Shortly after midnight, the household was awakened by the sound of something heavy falling in the study. Margaret discovered her husband collapsed beside his desk, clutching his throat. Dr. Benjamin Hayes, summoned from his bed, pronounced the captain dead from what appeared to be a sudden seizure. The stress of his demanding profession and his fondness for rich food and strong drink made such an ending seem tragically inevitable. Captain Sinclair's death left Margaret in control of a substantial shipping enterprise at a time when women rarely managed such businesses. Several competitors had been pressuring the captain to sell his fleet, offers he had consistently refused. With his death, these same men approached Margaret with renewed vigor, certain that a grief-stricken widow would be eager to liquidate her husband's assets. They were wrong. Margaret not only retained control of the shipping business, but expanded it aggressively, using her position to undercut her competitors' rates and secure exclusive contracts with several major plantations. Within months, she had effectively cornered Augusta's river transport market, leaving her former suitors to wonder how they had so badly misjudged the quiet widow. Traveling northeast from Augusta, our third case unfolds in the hill country of Habersham County, where the town of Clarksville was emerging as a center for the region's growing mining operations. Gold had been discovered in the Georgia mountains, and prospectors from across the eastern seaboard were flooding into what locals called the Cherokee Country. Eliza Whitman operated one of Clarksville's few boarding houses, catering to miners, speculators, and government surveyors who arrived daily seeking their fortunes. At 35, she had established herself as a formidable businesswoman, known for maintaining order among her often rough clientele and serving meals that reminded homesick men of their mother's cooking. The boarding house business required careful management of both finances and personalities. Eliza had learned to read men quickly, determining who could be trusted with credit and who needed to pay in advance. Her establishment's reputation for fairness and safety made it the preferred accommodation for more respectable travelers, including territorial officials and visiting merchants. Among her regular guests was Colonel Theodore Bramwell, a land commissioner responsible for surveying Cherokee territories slated for redistribution under the Indian removal policies. The colonel had been staying at Eliza's boarding house for 3 months, conducting surveys that would determine which lands would be opened to white settlement and which would remain, temporarily, under Cherokee control. Colonel Bramwell's work was both lucrative and controversial. His surveys directly influenced land values, and his recommendations carried enormous weight with territorial authorities. Several prominent speculators had attempted to influence his decisions through various means, from outright bribes to veiled threats, but the colonel had maintained his reputation for incorruptibility. In early October, Eliza received an unexpected letter from a woman claiming to be her cousin from Savannah. The letter included a recipe for peach preserves, described as a family tradition that had been requested by mutual relatives. The handwriting was elegant, and the recipe appeared authentic, complete with personal touches that suggested genuine family connection. Eliza was delighted to receive this connection to family she had lost touch with years earlier. She immediately began preparing the preserves, intending to serve them as a special treat for Colonel Bramwell, who had mentioned his fondness for such delicacies. On the evening of October 12th, Eliza presented the colonel with a jar of her newly made preserves as he reviewed survey maps in the boarding house's common room. Other guests watched with interest as the colonel sampled the preserves, declaring them superior to anything he had tasted since leaving Virginia. The colonel retired to his room shortly after 10 o'clock, carrying the jar of preserves with him. He was known for working late into the night, reviewing his surveys by candlelight, while enjoying small treats to maintain his energy. Other guests reported hearing the colonel moving about his room until nearly midnight, when silence settled over the boarding house. The following morning, Colonel Bramwell failed to appear for breakfast, highly unusual for a man known for his rigid schedule. When Eliza knocked on his door, receiving no response, she used her master key to enter. The colonel lay peacefully in his bed, as if he had simply passed away in his sleep, the empty preserve jar on his bedside table. Dr. Samuel Norris, hastily summoned from the county seat, attributed the death to heart failure, common enough among men who had spent years in military service under stressful conditions. The colonel's surveys were completed and submitted to territorial authorities without delay, opening thousands of acres of Cherokee land to white settlement. What the community didn't realize was that Colonel Bramwell had been having second thoughts about his recommendations. His private correspondence, discovered years later, revealed growing doubts about the justice of displacing Cherokee families from lands they had cultivated for generations. He had been preparing to request a delay in the land redistribution, a delay that would have cost speculators millions in potential profits. Our fourth case brings us south to the coastal plains of Wayne County, where the town of Jessup was establishing itself as a center for naval stores production. The vast pine forests that stretched from the Altamaha River to the Florida border provided turpentine, tar, and timber that supplied shipyards from Savannah to Charleston. Rebecca Morrison had inherited her late husband's turpentine operation 3 years earlier, making her one of the few women directly involved in Georgia's naval stores industry. At 41, she managed a workforce of both free and enslaved laborers, overseeing the complex process of extracting turpentine from slash pines and processing it into the various products demanded by maritime commerce. The business required constant negotiation with factors in Savannah who purchased her products for export. Rebecca had proven herself a shrewd negotiator, often securing better prices than her male competitors by leveraging the superior quality of her operations output. Her success had earned her respect but also resentment from men who believed the turpentine business too rough for feminine sensibilities. Among her most persistent challengers was Silas Crenshaw, a Charleston merchant who had been attempting to purchase her operation at below-market prices. Crenshaw argued that a woman couldn't possibly understand the complexities of naval stores production and that her continued independence would inevitably lead to business failure. His offers had grown increasingly aggressive as Rebecca's operation continued to prosper. In late October, Rebecca received a visit from a woman identifying herself as Mrs. Elizabeth Crenshaw, claiming to be Silas Crenshaw's sister-in-law. Mrs. Crenshaw explained that she had heard of Rebecca's reputation as both a businesswoman and a hostess, and wished to share a recipe that had made her famous in Charleston society. The recipe for peach preserves came with a touching story about how it had helped Mrs. Crenshaw win her husband's affections and establish herself among Charleston's elite. Rebecca was charmed by the gesture and touched by what seemed to be genuine feminine solidarity in a world dominated by masculine commercial competition. Rebecca prepared the preserves with particular care, intending to serve them to Silas Crenshaw during his next business visit. She hoped that sharing this feminine touch might soften his aggressive negotiating style and perhaps lead to a more collaborative relationship. Crenshaw arrived in Jessup on November 1st, expecting another confrontational meeting about Rebecca's continued refusal to sell her operation. Instead, he found her unusually accommodating, serving tea and the elegant preserves in her private office while discussing business matters in a relaxed atmosphere. The merchant consumed multiple servings of the preserves while reviewing Rebecca's production records, grudgingly admitting that her operation was more successful than he had realized. As the evening progressed, Crenshaw grew increasingly animated, discussing plans for expanding naval stores production throughout coastal Georgia. Shortly after 9 o'clock, Crenshaw excused himself to return to his lodgings at Jessup's only inn. The innkeeper later reported that Crenshaw had retired immediately upon his return, complaining of fatigue from his journey. When the merchant failed to appear for breakfast, the innkeeper discovered him dead in his bed, apparently having passed away peacefully during the night. Dr. Marcus Webb, the county's physician, attributed Crenshaw's death to apoplexy, noting that the merchant had appeared to be in robust health, but acknowledging that sudden death was not uncommon among men who lived stressful commercial lives. Crenshaw's death effectively ended the pressure on Rebecca to sell her operation, allowing her to continue building what would become one of coastal Georgia's most successful naval stores businesses. Our final case takes us west to the frontier county of Troup, where the village of LaGrange was slowly emerging from the wilderness along the Georgia-Alabama border. This was raw frontier country, where Creek warriors still occasionally raided isolated homesteads, and where justice was often dispensed by vigilante committees rather than established courts. Sarah Caldwell had arrived in Troup County as part of a wagon train of settlers seeking cheap land and new opportunities. At 29, she was already a widow, her first husband having died during the journey west from North Carolina. Sarah had used her husband's savings to purchase a small tract of land near LaGrange, where she established herself as a seamstress and occasional schoolteacher. Life on the frontier required resilience and adaptability. Sarah had proven capable of both, building a small but comfortable cabin, maintaining a vegetable garden, and establishing herself as a valuable member of the small community. Her education, unusual for frontier women, made her an important resource for families seeking to provide their children with basic schooling. The frontier's isolation also bred suspicion and violence. Land disputes were common, often resolved through intimidation or outright warfare. Sarah had witnessed several such conflicts, including the mysterious disappearance of families who had refused to abandon claims disputed by more powerful interests. One such dispute involved Sarah's own property. A man named Jeremiah Hawkins claimed that Sarah's land grant was fraudulent, arguing that the territory had been reserved for Creek negotiations and was therefore not available for settlement. Hawkins had been pressuring Sarah to abandon her claim, growing increasingly threatening as she refused to yield. In November 1821, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. A woman traveling through LaGrange had heard of Sarah's reputation as a seamstress and requested to commission a dress for her sister's wedding. During their conversation, the visitor mentioned a recipe for peach preserves that had become famous throughout the territory. Sarah was grateful for both the sewing commission and the recipe. Peach preserves were a luxury on the frontier, where fruit was scarce and sugar expensive. The ability to create such delicacies would enhance her standing in the community and provide additional income through sales to more prosperous families. When Jeremiah Hawkins arrived for what Sarah expected to be another confrontational meeting about her land claim, he found her surprisingly hospitable. She served him coffee and the elegant preserves while discussing their dispute in a calm, reasonable manner. For the first time, Hawkins seemed willing to consider a compromise that would allow Sarah to retain at least a portion of her property. The meeting continued through the afternoon, with Hawkins consuming multiple servings of the preserves while reviewing Sarah's land documents. He grew increasingly jovial as the day progressed, even suggesting that they might collaborate on developing the disputed territory rather than fighting over it. As evening approached, Hawkins mounted his horse for the return journey to his own homestead. Neighbors later reported seeing him riding normally along the frontier trail, but his horse returned riderless the following morning. A search party discovered Hawkins' body several miles from Sarah's cabin, apparently having fallen from his horse during the night. The frontier's dangers made such accidents commonplace. Wild animals, difficult terrain, and the constant threat of creek raids meant that men often traveled armed and alert. Dr. James Patterson, the circuit physician, attributed Hawkins' death to injuries sustained in the fall, noting evidence that his horse had been spooked by some unknown threat. Sarah inherited Hawkins' claim to the disputed territory by default, no other parties emerging to challenge her ownership. She eventually expanded her holdings to become one of Troup County's most successful landowners, using her education and business acumen to develop both agricultural and commercial enterprises. The connection between these 5 cases remained hidden until the spring of 1822, when a traveling merchant discovered Mrs. Caroline Whitmore's body in a remote cabin near the Oconee River. Among her possessions was a journal containing detailed plans for each of the 5 murders, along with correspondence revealing her true identity as Constance Blackwood, the mysterious widow who had disappeared from Athens following Judge Hartwell's death. The journal revealed a complex conspiracy involving land speculation, commercial competition, and political manipulation. Each of the 5 victims had posed threats to various interests that were connected through a network of investors and speculators seeking to profit from Georgia's rapid development. The peach preserve recipe had been Constance's own creation, developed through her knowledge of medicinal compounds inherited from her physician husband. Dr. Edmund Blackwood had been researching plant alkaloids before his death, seeking new treatments for various ailments. His widow had discovered that certain combinations of common spices, when prepared in specific concentrations, could produce a delayed poisoning that mimicked natural death. The preserve's sweetness masked any unusual taste, while their consistency allowed the toxic compounds to be absorbed slowly, creating symptoms that appeared hours after consumption. Constance's journal also revealed her motivations. Each murder had been commissioned by different parties, willing to pay substantial sums for the elimination of obstacles to their ambitions. Judge Hartwell's investigation of land fraud, Captain Sinclair's control of river transport, Colonel Bramwell's influence over Cherokee territory, Silas Crenshaw's commercial competition, and Jeremiah Hawkins' land dispute had all represented problems that certain individuals preferred to solve permanently. The conspiracy extended far beyond Georgia's borders, involving investors in Charleston, Savannah, and even New York who were speculating on the territory's development. Constance had served as their instrument, moving from county to county under different identities, carrying out assignments with clinical precision, while maintaining the appearance of a respectable widow seeking to rebuild her life. Her own death remained mysterious. The journal ended abruptly, with no explanation of how or why she had met her end in the isolated cabin where her body was discovered. Some speculated that she had been eliminated by her employers to prevent exposure of their conspiracy. Others suggested that she had fallen victim to the same poison she had used so effectively against others, perhaps through accident or suicide. The investigation that followed revealed the extent of corruption and violence that had characterized Georgia's territorial period. Several prominent citizens fled the state when their connections to the conspiracy were exposed. Land deals were overturned, fortunes lost, and reputations destroyed as authorities attempted to unravel the complex network of fraud and murder that had shaped the territory's development. The 5 women who had unwittingly served as Constance's accomplices were never charged with any crimes. Margaret Sinclair continued to operate her shipping business, Rebecca Morrison expanded her naval stores empire, Eliza Whitman became one of the mountain region's most successful hoteliers, and Sarah Caldwell developed her frontier holdings into a substantial plantation. Only Prudence Hartwell seemed to suffer long-term consequences, eventually selling her property and departing Georgia for destinations unknown. The recipe itself was never recovered. Authorities who searched Constance's effects found only the journal and correspondence related to her conspiracy. The formula that had made her poison possible disappeared with her death, taking its deadly secrets to whatever grave ultimately claimed her remains. The case of the 5 kitchen conspiracies became a cautionary tale about the dangers of rapid territorial development and the corruption that could flourish in regions where legal institutions were weak and economic opportunities vast. It demonstrated how individual ambition could create networks of violence that reached across state boundaries and social classes, binding together perpetrators who might never meet but shared common interests in eliminating obstacles to their success. Georgia's transformation from territory to state had come at a terrible price. paid not only by the Cherokee and Creek peoples who lost their ancestral lands, but also by individuals whose deaths served the ambitions of men who preferred to remain in the shadows. The 5 victims of Constance Blackwood's conspiracy represented different aspects of this transformation: the legal system, commercial development, territorial expansion, resource extraction, and frontier settlement. Their deaths also illustrated the particular vulnerabilities of the territorial period, when established institutions were weak and personal relationships often determined who prospered and who perished. The fact that 5 separate murders could be coordinated across multiple counties without detection revealed the primitive state of law enforcement and communication in early Georgia. Perhaps most disturbing was the ease with which Constance had been able to assume different identities and gain the trust of her victims. The territorial period's emphasis on hospitality and mutual assistance among settlers had created opportunities for predators willing to exploit social conventions for deadly purposes. The recipe that connected these crimes had been presented as a gesture of feminine solidarity, using cultural expectations about women's roles to mask murderous intentions. The kitchen conspiracies of 1821 remained Georgia's most complex murder case until well into the 20th century. The handwritten recipe that had made it all possible became a symbol of how domestic life could be weaponized and how the most innocent gestures could conceal the most violent intentions. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of early Georgia's most chilling mysteries. The 5 kitchen conspiracies remind us that history's most fascinating cases often lie hidden in dusty archives, waiting for someone willing to piece together the fragments of forgotten lives and forgotten crimes. I'm grateful to those of you who stayed with us through these dark tales from the territorial period, and I welcome your thoughts and comments about these interconnected mysteries. Until we meet again next week for another exploration of history's shadowed corners, remember that truth often proves stranger and more terrifying than any fiction we might imagine.